What happens when a nonfiction picture book refuses to stay in its lane? Today's episode explores a book that blends literary history, visual storytelling, metafiction, and picture book craft, all while tracing how Winnie the Pooh came to life. And somewhere along the way, the bear himself starts talking back. I'm chatting with author Annette Bay Pimentel about her fascinating new book, How a Bear Became a Book. And I have a copy from my library here. And this is the collaboration that created Winnie the Pooh, illustrated by Faith Prey. And we're digging into collaboration, rule breaking nonfiction, and the magic that happens when words and pictures truly work together. So, welcome to Nonfiction Kidlit Craft Conversations, the podcast where we explore the craft, creativity, and business of writing nonfiction for children. I'm your host, Kirsten W. Larson. Today, I'm joined by Annette Bay Pimentel, author of this inventive new picture book, How a Bear Became a Book, a Junior Library Guild selection with 4-starred reviews. Welcome to the show, Annette.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here and a fan of yours.
Yeah, so I was telling Annette earlier, I have been a fan of Annette's work for years. In fact, I used two of her books, Before Colors and Before Music, as mentor texts while working on my latest book, Shape of Her Stories. So Annette has a true gift for taking these big, layered ideas and making them accessible and engaging for young readers. And I am excited to get into it. So, your latest book, it's super ambitious. For those who haven't read it yet, and I encourage you all to pick up a copy, it's not just about A. Milne and Ernest Shepard, who were the creators of the Winnie the Pooh books, but this book also gets into how a book gets made, the evolution of books as not just words, but also words and pictures, and then how characters truly come alive on the page. So there was a lot going on in this book. I would really love to know, how did this story come to you and what did it look like when the idea kind of first came knocking on your door?
So I was looking for an idea to work on while my husband's a professor and he was going on sabbatical, and so I knew I was going to be in Europe for a year. And my work is very dependent on sources and archives. And so I was thinking, well, what can I work on for that year? And I was casting about for ideas, and I saw that the anniversary of the Winnie the Pooh book is coming up. And that immediately struck my interest. In, I think it was 2015, there were a couple of really wonderful, in fact, a Caldecott Winnie book about Winnie the Pooh. And I loved those books and they were wonderful. But the one thing, even then, that I thought about is that they didn't really capture my experience of reading the Winnie the Pooh books when I was a child. I was a very credulous, serious child. And I loved reading, and I loved reading that book, but I knew there were things that probably were supposed to be funny in that book that I did not really get the joke of until I looked at the illustrations. So the illustrations in those books were kind of my way of understanding what was going on in the books. And the books, as wonderful as they were, that came out in 2015, did not talk about E.H. Shepard at all. And so I thought, oh, that's what I want to do, is I want to write a book about E.H. Shepard. And so the project actually started out as a really traditional picture book biography of E.H., but it wasn't all that interesting. My early drafts were really, the tone just felt wrong. It was not a tone that matched the experience of the books. And of course, if you're writing about an illustrator, you're obviously also going to be writing about the author. And it was particularly difficult because that relationship, while it was very fruitful and very successful, was not always easy. And when I wrote about it in the traditional picture book format, it ended up coming across as being really conflict ridden. And in fact, which is probably my own limitations as a writer, but I remember a critique partner telling me, Milne sounds really mean. And I thought, oh, that's not what I'm going for at all. And so eventually, as I was trying to figure out how to tell this story about a book that I really loved, I tried lots of different solutions and eventually realized that maybe the book could depict what it's about, which is the slow and incremental process of a character being created.
And it's fascinating. So, for those who haven't seen the book, I mean, there are so many things going on, right? I mean, we start with Mel, we get Shepard coming in with the illustrations, but we also have Winnie the Pooh kind of emerging as this separate character who has his own lines and very Winnie the Pooh lines that any lover of Winnie the Pooh is going to recognize his obsession with honey. So in terms of that
Mhm.
piece, how did that aspect come apart? So it's more than just the collaboration of the two.
Mhm.
You also have the formation and the coming into being of Pooh himself, which is happening throughout the course of the book.
Yeah. And Kirsten, you sent me really specific questions, which was great. And I thought, oh, I don't remember exactly when it emerged. So I went back into my files and I looked to see when he came in as a narrator. And I remembered when I looked at it that early on I tried a lot of different structures. Finally, there was one draft that I did like that seemed to be working better than a lot of the others. And in that, I had the narrator stating a fact, and then in parentheses, that same narrator would like comment on what he had
Mm,
just said in a more informal tone. So, like where you say something and then you say, and by the way, that kind of thing.
right.
So I shared that draft with some of my critique partners, and I have a writing friend, and she's actually my neighbor too, Aya Sumner, was just finishing her edits on this wonderful picture book called The Good Little Mermaid's Guide to Bedtime. And in that book, it's a metafictional book. And she has a mermaid who is reading a book about bedtime that's
Hmm.
saying, this is what you do, and this is what you do. And the mermaid is really spunky and feisty and argues with the book. And so she saw that version with the parentheses that was all one narrator.
Hmm.
And she suggested that I lean into the voiciness because they were kind of two different voices and consider making a dialogue between the narrator and the voice inside the parentheses. And so we were talking about this at our critique group. And some of the other members of the critique group started, I realized they were assuming that that other voice would be Winnie the Pooh. And that actually startled me because, I write nonfiction, so I don't have like inanimate objects, or, well, he's not, I don't have
Well, he
fictional
is, yeah.
characters speak. Yeah.
Yeah.
But it was an intriguing idea. And in the spirit of, well, I'll try anything once, I went back to the novels and I made myself a little cheat sheet of what makes Pooh sound like Pooh. And then I tried to go back into the manuscript and take out the parentheticals and put them in Pooh's voice. And it was really fun. And that was my 12th draft. I number my drafts, and it was draft number 12. And it still went through about 8 more revisions before we send it out. But that 12th draft is where the basic bones of the structure that it's now in was there. So definitely something that I never would have arrived at without many very good writing friends reading my work and talking to me about it.
Well, and I think we can't overstate this point enough, right? Critique partners can so often see something in our writing that we are maybe too close to see.
Yeah.
And having those trusted partners to help you pull things out is critical.
Yeah, and seeing their example of how they're playing with their manuscripts, I think even if someone had suggested it to me, if I had not read Aya's manuscripts through different iterations and seen how she was working on that, I think that emboldened me in ways that I might not have had the vision if I hadn't been able to see what someone else did. And I mean, our narrators are very different. My Pooh's very sweet, and there are a lot of things that are different, but just the process of what she was doing was very much what I ended up doing. Yeah.
Well, and it's interesting that your critique group sort of provided a playground where you got to kind of hash out the ideas a little bit before going back to the page.
I like that idea of the critique group as a playground. That's beautiful.
Well, and that's the thing. I mean, I think so many people come to writing thinking that it is such a solitary process. And there are pieces of it when it's
Mhm.
just you and the page and the keyboard and the, pencil or whatever. But we don't do any of it alone, right? As we see from your book, as we see from your
This
experience, there's so much collaboration that it takes.
this is very true. That's been my experience for sure.
That's wonderful. So, just out of curiosity, have you been with your critique partners for a very long time?
Yeah, I have a couple of different critique groups. One is a
Mhm.
local critique group, and there's a lot more kind of churn in that group as people who think they might be interested in writing for kids come and go. And we've had that critique group going for about 11 years now. And then I have an online critique group that is solely picture books. And we've been together, I think it's either 7 or 8 years. So, yeah, so they're
Wow,
very long relationships now at this point.
that's great. So we talked a little bit about sort of what inspired your angle or your lens.
Mhm.
We talked about those, 2015 books,
Mhm.
Finding Winnie
Right.
and Winnie, the True Story of the Bear Who Inspired Winnie-the-Pooh, which really centered Milne.
Mhm.
And I mean, as we all know, part of the challenge of writing nonfiction is we can often sometimes we can tell the same story, but we have to have a unique lens or a
Mhm.
unique focus. And you mentioned a little bit about thinking about Shepard
Mhm.
and his illustrations. And so can you talk a little bit more about how you chose that particular angle of the collaboration between them and that was really the piece that you wanted to tell?
Yeah, so I knew that the part of the story that hadn't been told in picture books was the E.H. Shepard piece of it. And so I started researching E.H. Shepard. And so I read biographies of him and I read pieces that dealt critically with his work and what he had done. And as I read about what happened, then I realized there was a lot of connection between Milne and Shepard. And this is quite different from the way books are made now. As writers, we don't really work during the process with the artist one on one, but they did. They actually met together and they talked about it. They had some disagreements, like about what the bear should look like. Milne wanted it to look like his son's teddy bear, and Shepard thought that that didn't look like a very cozy bear. There was a lot of interaction. And I got very interested in that collaboration, especially because I thought that that's kind of where the magic of the books came. And there was
Mhm.
one particular book, it was actually a Victoria and Albert Museum exhibition.
Ah,
It was published from that.
mhm.
And it is, I jotted down the name of it so I would remember it, but it was a book about an exhibition that came out in 2018, Winnie the Pooh Exploring a Classic. And in that book, they contextualized where Winnie the Pooh fit in the broader publishing history, and including some images of early chapters of Winnie the Pooh before the book was published were published in newspapers and magazines, kind of as a promotion to
Mhm.
encourage people to buy the books. But oddly, they did not hire Ernest Shepard to do those illustrations. So they hired other illustrators who they gave the chapters to and then had them illustrate it. And so we actually get a little glimpse of what Winnie the Pooh could have looked like. And so in one of them, Pooh and Piglet look almost exactly alike in the
Wow.
illustration. And in another one, Winnie the Pooh looks like he's about 6 feet tall and he wears a bow tie and a derby hat and he has a cane and fancy shoes. And when I saw those, I realized I don't know if Winnie the Pooh would have become the icon that it is if another illustrator had been there. And I realized that I thought that's what I wanted the book to really be about. It's about how the Winnie the Pooh that we know is not just the creation of Milne or just the creation of Shepard,
Mhm.
but really came about when these two people brought their best game and together they created something that neither could have done by himself.
Well, it's interesting. That other Winnie the Pooh almost sounds like Paddington Bear to me. You know what I
Oh,
mean? It's
sorry.
in some
Yeah.
ways the more kind of sophisticated
Yeah.
bear.
And about town kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Well, and it's interesting because Winnie the Pooh has resonated so much. I have two teenage boys, one almost 20, and they don't tell them I'm saying this, but I mean, they still have their Winnie the Poohs. It was like the first stuffed animal that
Yeah.
they had as kids, and the bear is still on the bed, you know.
Yeah.
I
I
mean, there's something about that character.
As I've been doing promotion, I'm almost every time I go to a bookstore or a school, an adult comes up to me and tells me about their stuffed Winnie the Pooh that they still hold dear. So I think it is a very common experience.
Yeah, obviously they Milne and Shepard brought something and created something truly magical.
Yeah.
Well, so shifting gears a little bit, when you and I were kind of chatting over email, I told you that one thing I thought that was so delightful about this book is that it, as a nonfiction writer, it feels kind of like a rule breaker. We have Winnie the Pooh, this fictional character who is given voice in the book. He's not just in the illustrations, he has lines. And you told me that you thought that was interesting because you think of yourself as a rule follower.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about that process. We have this metafictional element. Faith Prey illustrates Winnie becoming more solid and more of a character from the beginning of the end of the book. So, how are you, as a primarily nonfiction writer,
Mhm.
how are you wrestling with these lines between fiction and nonfiction and creating a book that is true with, you know, when you're dealing with metafiction and fictional characters in the book?
Yeah, this book was a leap of faith for me. You're exactly right. And it is the first book that I've written that was not nonfiction to its core. When that critique group initially suggested that I make the voice Winnie the Pooh, my first reaction was, I can't do that because that takes me into really dangerous territory. And so I thought a lot about what matters. I've been reading your book, Telling It True, and you have a line in there where you're talking about choosing between nonfiction and informational fiction, where you say, do what's best for your book. And I realized that what I was considering trying to do would not be to obscure what really happened. It wouldn't be inventing dialogue and making the reader think that that was something that
Mhm.
somebody said, but that instead it would be a way to illuminate the process in a way that I had, for 12 drafts, I had been struggling to do. And so I decided that it was worth trying in at least a draft. And so once I let myself tiptoe into that informational fiction territory, the manuscript just really felt different. It really perked up. And I realized that it was the right choice for this particular project.
Well, and my corollary to that is like we want the kids to read the book, right? We want them to want to read the book,
Yeah.
love the book. And so sometimes it's taking a risk like that that makes the book truly special. And when they see a favorite character in the book, now maybe they're more inspired to read about Milne and Shepard and how the
Yeah.
books came to be.
Yeah, and I think there's a big difference between informational fiction and something that is masquerading as
Mhm.
nonfiction. Like when I was growing up, I loved reading what I thought were biographies. And years
Right.
later, I discovered that they were not biographies, that they were kind of about real, like based on the lives of real
Right.
people, but not really true. And I think that informational fiction occupies that middle ground where it's not pretending to be what it is not. And I think
Right.
that matters. I think that kids deserve the respect of knowing what it is that they're consuming. Yeah.
Well, and I think in reading this book, most children realize that Pooh is a fictional character. So it's not like you're pulling the wool over somebody's
Exactly.
eyes, you know, with Pooh speaking. Kids are going to realize that he's
Yeah.
a made-up character who's just kind of commenting.
Yeah.
But yes, I think to your point, do what's best for your book,
Yeah.
right? We want readers to want to read the book.
Yeah.
That's the most important thing. Yeah. And then play fair. with the reader, right? If it's not obvious that
Yeah.
it's Pooh talking, if you have had to take some creative license with the book, then in an author's note, please let us know
Yeah.
what creative choices you made and why.
Yeah.
So one quote from the book that really stood out to me is this one. Sometimes words need pictures and pictures need words. When they find each other, characters spring to life. So, I think the other sort of thread in this book that maybe we haven't talked about yet is kind of book history.
Hmm.
Before books like Winnie the Pooh, even in illustrated books, texts and illustrations were sort of treated separately. And here in this book, they are on the same page. In some cases, you have text being used to mimic the height of a tree by stacking the words tall, right? So we're really playing with the design of the book to reinforce what's on the page. So that that is a whole other piece of history. It's a whole other aspect now that you have to do some research on, like sort of book history. So how did you go about researching illustrated children's books so you could kind of place this book in that context?
Yeah, I mentioned the Victoria and Albert Museum exhibit book that was really important in my research. And it talked a little bit about it. And so while I was in London, then I went to the British Library and I requested and looked through a large number of 1926 juvenile books, especially ones by the same publisher, so that I could see for myself what other books that were published then generally looked like. And it was really startling to me to see because it gave me this huge appreciation for how much more modern Winnie the Pooh looks. And it helped me understand better what they did with page design. I also followed up some references that I'd seen other places about some of the correspondence that was between Shepard and the editors. And I went to University of Surrey
Mm,
and looked in their archives. They had some of his correspondence, and he had a letter to his editors where he was arguing that he was originally paid for his work with Milne as a work for hire project.
mm,
And then he started arguing, I really should get more because this is a ton of work because I'm not doing just the illustrations
mhm,
like you do with your other books, but we are actually designing every page. And Milne ended up siding with Shepard and encouraging the editors to give him a royalty, which he did get for the other books. And so it was really interesting to like kind of find the little pieces in the history about how important Milne and Shepard both felt like the page design was. Sadly, we don't have a good sense of exactly how the editor worked with this. There were two editors, and I think one kind of functioned probably more as an art director would now. But anyway, it became clear that the four of them, or at least three of the four, three or four of them worked together like we do now in books to make sure not just that the art is great and that the words are great, but that the art and the words work together on the page. So it's the idea of the experience that a reader and a child will have as they are in this book. Yeah, and so I followed little breadcrumbs that I found in the secondary sources and then went with that.
And so, why was it important for you to want to include those innovations as part of the story for kids?
I think that when I write about history, it feels like context is a large part of what I'm trying to do. And I think part of why I wanted to write about that is I had not realized how innovative Winnie the Pooh was. And then I get very excited about it. And I go back and I look in the books and I think, oh, wow, yeah, look at that. I never realized that that was happening. Although I do think it was a core part of the experience, but kind of an unnoticed core part of the experience. And so I wanted to make sure that I was sharing with kids as big a vision as I could about what it meant to collaborate. And I think part of that collaboration for me in my work and for Milne and Shepard was not just the illustrator author collaboration, but also the role that other publishing people play in that.
In your back matter, you do
Mhm.
mention the editors, and then you and Faith like call out
Mhm.
everybody who worked on your book, which may be the only picture book I've ever seen where everybody is acknowledged.
That
I
was
love
so
it.
fun. I'm sure there are people we left out, but we did get to acknowledge more than you usually do, which was super fun.
Yeah. Well, and I love that I think what you're showing us is that a lot of times as nonfiction authors, we are sort of the stand-ins for the curious kids who we're writing for. And if something is surprising, delighting, and exciting for us,
Mhm.
then we hope that it's going to be the same for our readers. So if this whole new way of thinking about illustrated books was captivating for you, hopefully the reader's going to feel the same.
That is so true.
Yeah. And so this whole book, you're telling the story, but you're also showing the story. I mean, it's really show don't tell,
Mhm.
which is something I think all authors struggle with. Were you really trying to sort of weave in these different craft lessons for kids about the importance of showing and telling?
I don't know how conscious the show versus tell idea was, but I did understand at some point as I was trying to, I would sometimes get very confused with the two, because there are two narrators, Winnie the Pooh and then this other narrative voice. And I would sometimes get very confused about how they were working together. The thing that kept me persisting despite that confusion is that I would think that this book will be able to kind of show what the book's about. And I love books that manage to do that, to show whatever it is that they're talking about. I
Yeah.
think it's hard to pull off. And so I'm glad you think I did, or that we did, rather.
Right. Right. So this is obviously a very collaborative book when it comes to Milne and Shepard. You have mentioned that typically illustrators and authors don't work together today in quite the same manner. I'm curious specifically about how you and Faith Prey may or may not have worked together on this book. So, can you tell me a little bit about your relationship when it came to illustrating the book?
Yeah. So original Faith was not the first illustrator that they tried to attach to this project. And there was another illustrator who was initially very excited about it right until she read my manuscript. She was sort of concerned about some aspects of the manuscript. And so the publisher set up a Zoom call between me and her so we could talk about it. And then she canceled at the last minute before the call. And she said, this manuscript is just fundamentally unillustratable. It cannot be illustrated. And her reasoning was that what she does is she creates a character, and then that character continues throughout the entire book. And she said, what this manuscript is asking me to do is to create a character and then change the character and change the character. And so, how can you have a character if it's always changing? And I read what she wrote and I thought, oh, she's right. And I was so horrified. And I thought I had written an unillustratable manuscript. And the editor, Mark Podesta, he told me, no, 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 she's just not the right illustrator for this project. And so I was still very worried about it right until I saw Faith's initial sketches. And she's talked, since then, we've talked together. And she told me that it felt like unpacking a riddle, that she realized there were all these different layers and she had to find ways to honor the different layers of the telling. And she did, she managed to do it. I had this kind of vague idea of how it would all look, but I'm not a very visual person. And so I tend to think of what, as I'm writing, I kind of see blobs. I know where pages will turn, but I don't know necessarily what will be on the page. And she managed to solve that problem. And it was a riddle for her that she managed to figure out her way into it. So I was deeply grateful. And once I saw her initial sketches, I thought, yes, yes, this is totally what I kind of was blindly aiming towards. And she managed to find the way to depict it.
Yeah, I mean, it is absolutely amazing. So I had a follow on question, which is
Mhm.
Were there extensive illustration notes? It sounds like the answer to that is no.
Well, yeah, I went back and looked at what we sent her, and I assume this is what she got. I guess I don't know what Mark took out,
Hmm.
but I had one overall illustration note, and it said, throughout the book, the personified story interacts with the narrator. The personified story might be represented by a ghostly version of Winnie the Pooh emerging from the page of written words. And as the words and pictures combine on the page, the personified story might become more complete, more distinct, or more colorful, for example. So that's kind of what she got.
Well, and that's what she did. And I think, well, one thing I love for readers when you finally read this book is, did she use, like, there's these stamped text
Mhm.
elements? It looks like she stamped the drawings. I just,
Yes. Yeah, she's done a video actually of how
oh.
she did it, and she ordered a copy of the handwritten text that Mill
Hmm.
did, and then also a copy of one of the early printings.
Hmm.
And then she made stamps, and she created this entire system for making like the ghost of Winnie the Pooh.
So, so obviously it was a relief when you got the illustrations. How else did you feel? Was it like, oh, this is better
Yeah.
than I ever imagined?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And there are a couple of specific, you'd asked if there were any moments
Mhm.
where I felt like what I had written kind of was expanded or changed
Mhm.
by what she did. And there are actually two that spring to mind. And one is the page where the book introduces A. Milne,
Mhm.
and so A. Milne is here and he has written the words. And on the facing page, then what Faith has done is she's just circled the text with these pages of writing.
Mhm.
And there's a very, very shadowy bear that you just barely see. It's just the silhouette of a bear just starting to emerge from the pages. And she has both Milne's handwritten text and also typed text. And what I wrote reads, the words lingered on the page waiting, 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 waiting. Wait, what am I waiting for? In Pooh's voice. And I thought that this was such a great depiction of what it's like to be an author where you send off your words, and I at least only have just the very vaguest idea of what those characters are going to end up looking like on the page. And it's like I and the character am just waiting for what the illustrator has to bring to it. So that was one where I thought, wow, she's totally depicted in a really emotionally satisfying way the experience of what it is to be an author.
Yes. Waiting, waiting, waiting.
Yeah. And then there's another page farther down when Pooh is finally becoming a fully realized character. And the way the text that I wrote goes is it says, back in his studio, Ernest added make believe to his real life drawings. And that's true. He liked drawing out in real life. He would take his sketchbook everywhere, but then he would go back and work in his studio. And so I was just trying to depict that in the
Mhm.
words. And they were almost, when I wrote them, almost throwaway words. I was trying to give the suggestion that there's a process and iterations in art as well as in writing. But then Faith did an amazing thing with the art for that page. So what she did is she has the illustration where we see Winnie the Pooh becoming a fully realized character, but then behind it, she took things from her own studio that she
Oh.
had used in her own character development. So she has a map that she used. It's based on the really famous Ernest Shepard map when
Mhm.
she was working on the character design. She also photoshopped in the little paint smudges where she was mixing paint. These were actually she told me that it was her palette that she
Oh,
photographed.
wow.
And then she also includes her own, you have to look really carefully when you're looking at the book, but there are these little handwritten notes that she's written to herself about her sketches. So it says like jar of honey, then with like a little line. And so she's the text is talking about Ernest Shepard's
Mhm.
studio, but she brought her own studio into this page. And it's such a
Oh,
powerful doubling and showing that like what we see and what we experience only comes about through this added layer of the artist's work. So I
wow.
love that page too.
And you know what? So I'm just going to say for everybody who loves Winnie the Pooh, like you have to buy this book. It's so because you have to be able to study all of this up close. It is just so so beautiful.
Faith's art is totally worth it. It is amazing art. She did just an incredible job of
Oh,
creating her own distinct Winnie the Pooh that totally honors the Ernest Shepard Winnie the Pooh. But you had asked about illustration notes, and one thing I did want to mention is I did have like a couple of other illustration notes through there, but I was trying to be really spare in
sure.
illustration notes. But even so, I put in too many because I had had one note and I got this note back from the editor saying, is it really important that it be PJs? And he sent two drawings that Faith had done, one of the little character in
Mhm.
pajamas, and then one, the impossibly cute narrator
Yes.
that we have who's in
Oh,
lashes. And she said,
yes.
I would kind of rather do this. And I thought, well, of course we want to do this one. And I realized, oh, I need to be even more careful about how many illustration notes I put in because I
Right.
do know illustrators feel very constrained by them. And so, yeah. So even
Yeah.
a few illustration notes, it was too many.
Well, shifting gears, we've talked a little bit about your research. You knew
Mhm,
you were going to be in Europe, so
mhm,
you had access to a lot of archives in the UK.
mhm.
Even given your proximity to your subject matter, were there any challenges that you encountered, things that you couldn't find that you really wanted when it came to researching this book?
Yeah, I would have liked to know more about the editor and about
Mm.
the editorial process. I read a biography of the editor, so I know some stuff about him, but the archives from the publishing house burned in a fire many years ago. And so they just don't exist. Or maybe I just didn't figure out where they were. I would have liked to have known more about the editorial relationship.
Mm.
And I never found material that could
Yeah.
illuminate that.
It happens. So you've included so much in the back matter. We have talked about it a little bit. I love that the editors, designers, art directors, everybody's getting recognition in the back matter. And you talk a little bit about some of the different functions of bookmaking.
Mhm.
Tell me a little bit about your back matter process. Is this something that you're thinking about while you're writing? And then how do you think about what needs to be included in the back matter and what it needs to accomplish?
Yeah, that is a really good question. I really adore back matter. And with my first book, I thought of back matter, the main text as being where kids read, and the back matter as being what adults read. And I was quite shocked with my very first book events that there is a subset of children who are very avid back matter readers. And I had written this back matter that was really written kind of in an adult voice. And I had these kids who had read every word and like had questions about the back matter. And I realized, oh, okay, I am not giving kids their full due, that there are kids who love back matter. And so for me, when I write back matter, it's important to me that the voice of the back matter be quite different from the voice
Mhm.
of the main text. I want them to be in conversation with each other. And I want them to answer the questions that I think that the book might raise. In the main text, then we talk about Ernest instead of Shepard and Alan instead of Milne. In the back matter, we talk about Shepard and Milne. So that's one of the examples of difference
Right.
in tone. And so I tried to think of all the questions that you might have while you were reading the book, and also all the stuff that I wished I could put in the main text,
Right.
put back there. Information about the many collaborators that work on books today. So actually, when I submitted the initial manuscript, it did include in the back matter calling out the editor and art director, and I just put little X's there.
Right. TBD.
Yeah, right. Because that did feel like a really important part. And I was kind of worried that they would take that out, but they were good sports and they stuck with it all the way through. I also realized, I don't think I have done this consciously, but I realized with this book especially that the back matter kind of ends up being my outline for my school visits, where all the stuff, like when I give a school visit, I usually try to add extra information. And I realized that most of what I talk about extra in the school visits, I make some reference to in the back matter. And then in my school visits, I expand a little bit more. So it's kind of like my own personal, okay, this is what I'm going to tell kids about when I go and get to talk to them about the book.
I think what's amazing to me is so many kids are fascinated by how a book gets made, right?
Mhm.
I know when we did the Fire of Stars, we were able to get some printing videos and show kids the
Oh.
book on the printer. Like kids are just fascinated by the whole process, text and
Mhm.
illustration and layout. So I think what's really fascinating is you've told this piece of history, but you've also provided a model for kind of how a book gets made and for
Mhm.
storytelling and maybe inspiring young writers and illustrators to tell their own stories. So, I mean, I can imagine this book being used in like English language arts classrooms to talk about, how do we tell a story? How do we create it? So, I mean, did you, when you were writing it, did you have that thought that maybe this could be used in that way?
I didn't think specifically about language arts classrooms, although I hope that they will. But I do hope, I was thinking about how I hoped people and young readers especially would think hard about how art and text work together. And it's been wonderful as I've been out in schools and starting to talk about this, the conversations about the art. And I've been shown many things about the art by my young, it's
Yes.
wonderful. Yeah, and they pointed out elements of the art that I had not noticed. It's reminded me of just how very central the art is to the experience of reading picture books and to young, whether readers are already independent readers or not, the art is such an integral part of the experience of the books and as it's intended to be. So I
I mean,
did hope, yeah, that it would create conversations.
yeah, I mean, they definitely pick up on things I've had that same experience where they see things in the art that I have completely missed. And they're just,
Yes.
oh, of course. Of
Yeah.
course. That's how it is.
Yeah.
So, young readers aside, right? This is a
Mhm.
book for young readers, but many of us adult creators are going to read this and be amazed by what you're doing. So, for your fellow writers, for illustrators, what do you hope that they will take away from this book? How do
Hmm.
you hope that they will be inspired?
I hope that they will be inspired to trust. I hope writers will be inspired to trust illustrators and that illustrators will be inspired to not feel constrained by what the text might be, but to feel emboldened to add their own elements to it. Yeah.
I love that idea. I love that. Okay, well, we are about out of time, and I really, really appreciate you joining me today. I mean, this is
Oh,
just such a fascinating exploration of storytelling, collaboration, nonfiction, and what nonfiction can be when we kind of embrace play and maybe doing things that are outside of our typical comfort zone.
it-
So, again, the book that we're talking about today is How a Bear Became a Book. This is by Annette Bay Pimentel, illustrated by Faith Prey. And Annette, I know a lot of times we aren't able to share what's coming up for us, but do you have anything that you can share that might be next for you?
I do. I have another book coming out probably next April, and it's called Turtle on the Tarmac. It is also informational fiction, but it's about based on how JFK Airport deals with turtles that end up on the runway. It's written in rhyme, which I never thought I would write in rhyme, and is written for very, very young readers. It's about 100 words long, but tells the story of two paths converging.
So again, you're pushing boundaries. You're pushing your own
I
boundaries.
am trying. I am playing. That's what I'm doing.
Wonderful. Well, Annette, where can readers learn more about you and your books?
I have a website. It's my name, so AnnetteBayPimentel.com. And I am occasionally on Instagram, most often enjoying other people's posts, but occasionally posting there, and it's at Annette Pimentel.
Excellent. Well, if you have enjoyed today's conversation, please subscribe, leave a review, and share the episode with your fellow nonfiction creators. Until next time, happy writing and revising.